All right, great. Well, I'm going to start by just showing you some images of the effects of climate change that we're seeing already. So we know that climate change is associated with more frequent flooding. In this case, you can see that it's associated with sea level rise, so the storm surges come further inland. It's also associated with drought, melting glaciers, of course, and wildfire. And I show you these pictures because I think when you sort of just have this visual image, you can really start to recognize how climate change is going to have an impact on human health. We often, I think, sort of casually think of it as, oh yes, it's going to be bad for polar bears and other species and glaciers are melting, but the connection to human health is not always so obvious, and yet it's pretty strong. And before talking about some of those impacts, I just want to say why is it important to look at these effects of climate change on health? One reason is that for many people, the topic of climate change can seem very remote and distant. As I just suggested, something that concerns polar bears, but not something that concerns them. So thinking about the human impacts can really personalize the issue and bring it closer to home. Talking about health impacts also importantly transcends what we often see as a partisan divide in this country between that's associated with people's attitudes towards climate change. So everybody's concerned about health and wants to protect human health. And finally, in a very sort of practical way, we need to understand the impacts so that we can start to prepare for them. So I'm going to give you a lot of somewhat depressing information about the impacts of climate change on health, but I want to assure you that I am going to end on a more positive note. So I have the broad overarching question: how can climate change affect human well-being? And I use this picture. Some of you may have seen this picture before. It's actually a picture from the Dust Bowl. And I use it because it's a wonderful picture, but to remind us that we've already seen impacts of climate, of major climate changes, as with the Dust Bowl, how that affected human well-being, emotional well-being, their sort of the economics of the country, migration of people from places like Oklahoma and so on. So it's not completely new, and we have this example of how climate can affect humans. There are different categories of effects that it's worth thinking about to get a sense of the broad way in which climate change can affect people. And some of these are direct, so we can directly experience the effect of climate. Some of them are indirect. Consequences of climate change can in turn have their effects on human health. Climate change is also associated with both acute events and more gradual changes. So as I already suggested, it's associated with increased major storms, floods, wildfires. Those are very specific events that it's easy to see their impact on human beings. But climate change, of course, is also associated with gradual changes. The effects of those changes are not quite as easy to see, but nevertheless very powerful. And third, I want to distinguish between experience and perception. And this is definitely building on my perspective as a psychologist. We all know that people who directly experience the effects of climate change are going to be affected by those impacts. But even people who are not directly experienced in any sort of objective way may be affected just by their perceptions of climate change, but their awareness that it's an issue. So we need to be aware of those things as well. And then, of course, climate change can affect our physical health, but also, as I think you're clued into by the fact that I'm a psychologist, affects mental health and well-being, and social relationships, which is something that a lot of people maybe don't give much thought to. And finally, we're beginning to ask questions about how climate change can affect some of our broader ways of thinking about the world and of our place in the world. And this is a diagram, and maybe Annie recognizes this because this was, comes from Eco-America, that I think helps to illustrate how geophysical impacts can lead to mental health effects. So climate change is associated with these physical impacts, just as a sample: wildfire, drought, flooding, rising sea levels, changing patterns of precipitation, changing growing seasons, etc. Those physical impacts in turn affect human systems. So they affect our transportation networks, our food security, our energy infrastructure, economic sectors, among other things. We can see the connection of, again, major storms and flooding in impairing transportation networks and so on. And then both of these things can affect human health. So there are direct impacts of the physical impacts of climate change on health, but there are also indirect impacts mediated by these impacts on human systems. And then when we think about human health, you can divide it into physical health, mental health, and community health. But I want to emphasize how much these are all connected to each other, that physical health impacts mental health impacts physical health, community health and well-being can affect both physical and mental health, and so on. So it really is a big web of human well-being. But to start by talking about, I think, the most easy to visualize impacts of climate change. If you think about natural disasters, we know that they are associated with death. So pretty big impact there. Also injury, also disease. For example, flooding, such as the flooding associated with major storms, increases the likelihood of waterborne diseases. Perhaps less obvious, but there can be adverse birth outcomes for women who are pregnant during the experience of the natural disaster. There's an increase in preterm births, maternal complications, and low birth weight. These major events can also have indirect impacts through, again, their effects on structural systems. So food delivery can be disrupted, water delivery is disrupted, shelter, of course, can be destroyed. Health services are likely to be disrupted. They're not going to be operating as well. And you can imagine that there are plenty of people who rely on regular health services, perhaps diabetics or people who need shots of some sort. So when the health services are disrupted, that can be seriously a negative experience for them. You may or may not know that people who are under stress, their immune system doesn't work as well. So typically that will make them more vulnerable to other diseases, even though those aren't directly associated with climate change. There are actually also increases in domestic abuse following natural disasters. It's sad but true. It's probably a function of the stress that people just, their lives are much harder and they sometimes take it out on each other. Which clearly, even though domestic abuse is associated with a threat to physical health, can also have mental health effects. Some of the other impacts on mental health associated with natural disasters are post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and generalized anxiety. People are more likely to think about suicide and to commit suicide. There's increases in substance abuse. And all of these things don't necessarily go away within a week or two after the disaster. They persist, and in fact may last several years or longer. So the mental health effects of natural disasters are really, have a significant impact on human lives. And we actually have very good evidence about this, because even before people started to talk about climate change and mental health, they were studying the effects of natural disasters on mental health. So for example, Katrina is recent enough that most of us remember it, long enough ago that we've accumulated a good database about it. Almost 50% of the people living in affected areas developed an anxiety or mood disorder. 1 in 6 developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide more than doubled. Now, suicide is a pretty low-level problem, so more than doubling doesn't mean that it was still very common, but nevertheless, it was a significant increase. But thinking now about the gradual changes associated with climate change, the most, I think, pronounced one is increased temperatures, something to be aware of. As I mentioned before, changing patterns of precipitation. So even sometimes there's increases in rainfall, sometimes there's decreases, sometimes the amount is the same, but it tends to come all at once, which has a variety of effects. It can overwhelm the ability of the ground to absorb that much water, or the sewer system. Sea level rise, of course, and these things will also affect health. And these, in a way, are of greater concern because these gradual changes will affect more people than the people who are affected by natural disasters. So, for example, warmer air is associated with increased ground level ozone and holds more airborne particulates. So there's actually respiratory effects of warmer temperatures. People are more likely to develop asthma. You probably have already heard about the fact that asthma rates are going up. Dust storms are increased. This is particularly associated with drought. And there's something already called valley fever, which is a fungus that is disseminated through dust storms. So that can affect, people breathe it in and it impairs their health. Allergies are getting worse. We don't think of allergies maybe associated with climate change, but research suggests that many plants will have increased production of pollen. Poison ivy, for reasons that I certainly don't understand, is projected to become more toxic as the climate changes. And indoor mold is more likely. So just these kinds of things which are going to affect our respiratory systems are projected to lead to thousands more deaths in this country. I think that says by the year 2050, it's, let's see. Yeah, there we go, 2050. You've probably heard about the spread of infectious diseases. So we have these new diseases that have become publicized, West Nile virus, Zika, more closer to home for many of us in the US are ticks, which have been spreading across the country and affecting more, being found in states where they didn't used to be found. And people are increasingly having to modify their behavior just to avoid ticks. So we do have, and this is because with the changing temperatures, insects that used to not be able to survive in colder climates, they can now extend their spread farther north. So those insects sometimes carry these infectious diseases. And then of course, heat waves, we know have a direct effect on physical health. And we see this every time there is a heat wave, that people die. There are impacts on your kidneys, on your heart health, on your respiratory system, and hospital admissions go up during heat waves. And then clean water is actually projected to be less available than it is now. In my state, Ohio, we've been seeing these algae blooms that are threatening the water supply in part of the state for the last couple of years. Again, associated with the changing climate. And the Department of Interior, this is a little while ago, but already was talking about threats to water supply across the United States. I know you can't read the details on this map, but you can just, I think you can tell that red is bad. Orange is slightly less bad, and there are a number of places that are going to be facing these kind of water crises. And this is in the fairly near future. We know around the world, there are obviously countries that are already facing water crises. One of the things people talk about most as a threat of climate change is food insecurity. So there will be increased hunger. And it is true. So climate change will affect the agricultural potential of an area. Some places will become more productive, like the far north of Canada, for example, is projected to be able to grow more food. But the scientific projections say that overall, in balance, the effect will be negative. And the World Bank has estimated that, again, hundreds of millions will be at risk of hunger if we have this 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase, which is what people are talking about as at least a sort of baseline. We hope that it won't be higher. We hope that it won't be that high. It could indeed be higher. And then just kind of throw in, just so you get a sense of the scope of the impacts, traffic accidents may also go up. Now, of course, all kinds of other things might happen, self-driving cars. So on, I can't say that overall traffic accidents will go up, but the traffic accidents that are associated with climate are likely to increase because both precipitation, heavy storms increase accidents. People are more likely to die when the temperature is hot. And 603 deaths doesn't seem like a lot compared to 100 million, but it's still 603 people that we don't want to have die. Suicide rates actually go up as the temperature goes up. This is fairly recent data. We're not absolutely sure why, but there's evidence that suicide does go up with warmer temperatures. Hospitalization for mental illness goes up. And very good evidence that people are more aggressive when temperatures go up. They're essentially, people just seem to be near, we talk about the boiling point, right? So people are nearer their boiling point in higher temperatures. And actually cognitive abilities tend to go down. So this is one reason why places are moving towards more air conditioning in schools that didn't necessarily used to have air conditioning. Students just can't function as well on cognitive tests when the temperatures are really high. Oh, I think I'm blocking my own view here. Okay, indirect effects of climate change are due to things like economic difficulties, damage to infrastructure, as I mentioned, and environmental degradation. So just the fact that, for example, a lot of environments are turning into deserts. They're becoming much drier. They're less suitable for agriculture. And there are already migrants for this reason, and it's estimated there'll be millions more migrants in the near future. And I also want to say something, again, getting back to the idea of perceptions, about the way people's sense of their self might be affected. So we define ourselves often in terms of what we do, how we live our lives, our ability to make our own decisions and control our actions. And all of these things are potentially threatened by climate change. And then people have started to talk about something that is sometimes called solastalgia. That's not an official clinical term. It's just a term that was developed to describe the sadness that people feel associated with a perception that places they care about are changing. So here are a couple of quotes from people who are facing the effects of climate change. Australia has experienced a lot of drought in recent years, and you have this farmer saying, your garden is an oasis, but when our gardens die, it's depressing. You've just got dust at your back door. And I think kind of more profound to me, this quote from a Hurricane Sandy survivor: when you lose your house and everything you own, you learn everything is temporary. I mean, that's a pretty scary lesson to learn. So people might experience things like a sense of hopelessness. Again, this is associated not with, and suicide not associated with the extreme events like natural disasters, but just with the gradual change in climate. And in fact, there has been an increase in suicides, particularly among farmers who have been coping with drought. Some of the other things that people are facing as they think about climate change is this feeling of lack of control over what's happening. We learn certain ways of functioning in our environment. We maybe know what time the trees will bloom every year. So you might plan a trip to Washington, D.C. or to Japan to see the cherry blossoms. We learn what time to plant our flowers and our vegetables. We learn what kind of weather to prepare for in the winter. And the unpredictability of the climate reduces our sense of control and increases our sense of anxiety about what might happen. And then there's also these sort of social impacts. People say, and the US is not the only country where this is true, but I think it's worst in the US. Sometimes they say they don't want to bring up climate change because they think it's a controversial topic. So groups appear to be at war or in conflict over what particular events mean. Was a particular storm associated with climate change, or was it just a bad storm? Is it really it's the hottest, I can't remember if it's been the hottest July ever recorded, but it was the hottest June, I think, ever recorded. And so does that mean climate change, or is that just coincidence? There's also increasing tension, intergroup tension over perceived inequity. And I'll say more about that later, but when countries around the world talk about combating climate change, there's frustration from the countries that did not contribute to it, but nevertheless are experiencing the effects. They feel like the developed countries should be doing more. And then the people in the developed countries say, no, we shouldn't have to do more than our share. Every country should have to contribute. So climate change provides a basis for a sort of intergroup conflict. I already said people are more aggressive, and so you see increases in violence and crime. And in some cases, sort of weakened social ties. People are just not as nice to each other when it's hot. There are conditions associated with the climate change that actually impair interpersonal interactions. So there are places in the far north, for example, where people have a harder time visiting each other than they used to, because they used to be able to walk on the frozen lakes, and now the ice might not hold them, or maybe they didn't walk, maybe they went in snowmobiles, but now the ice won't hold them. There's I lost my place here. This doesn't seem to be, this is different than what I thought it was, but what does my heading here say? My headings, oh yes, national security. So this is along the lines of aggression and intergroup conflict. The Defense Department, this was a number of years ago in the previous administration, but the Defense Department did release a report on the security implications of climate change, which they view as a national security threat. Because, well, for one reason, we have refugee crises associated with changing climate, which means more intergroup and international conflicts. And there are countries, as I sort of suggested a minute ago, that are already blaming the US for climate change. So it can fuel those sort of international tensions. And then there are these threats to identity, as I suggested earlier, the way we think about ourselves, occupation, place, lifestyle, and autonomy. Some people's their occupation will be threatened. And this quote from the New York Times I was really struck by, because they talked about how ranching families were facing an existential threat an existential threat that's, again, pretty profound. That's not just temporary economic hardship. They're really having to rethink their occupations. And people who work in occupations that are associated with the land, farmers, ranchers, fishers, they tend to feel often very strongly about those occupations. They're very important to them. It's a way of life sometimes that's been passed down in their family for generations. So having to abandon those occupations is a real kind of threat to their well-being, and in some cases, mental health. And as I think I mentioned a minute ago, there are already increased rates of suicide among farmers. And in fact, they're higher than for any other occupational group because they're really already facing the effects of climate change. But there are other occupations that will also be affected. First responders experience a lot of increased stress because of the need to cope with these natural disasters associated with climate change. Indigenous communities, their way of life can be threatened. And I say indigenous communities because they tend to have a lifestyle, again, that's more closely connected to nature. And often they live in more vulnerable, geographically vulnerable parts. So the coastal areas, for example. And researchers studying indigenous communities, particularly in the sort of the north, but also in some African or kinds of countries, have found that they report their social networks are sometimes weakened because they can't engage in the kinds of rituals, the cultural rituals that are part of their lifestyle. The elders can't pass on their knowledge to the young people anymore because their knowledge is no longer accurate. And so they see increased levels of interpersonal conflict as well as substance abuse. And these are the picture on the, what would that be to you? The top picture is from Alaska, where not only are coastal communities being sort of washed into the sea, but the permafrost is thawing, and so they're sinking into the ground. And so many Alaskan communities, native Alaskan communities are threatened, and some have already had to be moved. But the bottom picture is actually from the Gulf. It's an island off the coast of Louisiana that is also being threatened by climate change, and also has people who are very tied to that area. It's part of their lifestyle, their culture, their heritage, and so they're very distressed about having to move. And farther afield, here's an example from Bolivia. Again, I like this quote, or I like this. I pulled out this story for two reasons. One is you can see just how much the lake has shrunk in the past few years, but they called themselves the people of the lake. And so they said, if there's no lake, who are we? So again, their identity is really called into question. And of course, some people have to migrate due to climate change. Natural disasters alone displaced about 19 million people last year. And these are just natural disasters, not the slower changes in the climate that may also lead to what have been called environmental refugees. And migration itself presents a health risk. Of course, it can be dangerous to migrate, physically dangerous. Immigrants are also, involuntary immigrants are more likely to develop mental health problems, psychoses. And that's partly because of the stress of migrating. It's also partly because, as we've all seen, migrants are not necessarily welcomed in the places where they go to. So the social context is another source of stress. And again, that can linger on into the second generation and longer. So as I think these last examples have already kind of illustrated, one of the things about climate change is that not everyone will be equally affected. So there's that issue of equity and injustice. The poorest countries will suffer the greatest health impacts. And within the US, the poorest communities are likely to bear the greatest burden. I was just in Nepal for an IPCC meeting, And we were honored that actually the Prime Minister of Nepal opened the meeting with some comments. And he talked about how, he said that Nepal's contribution to climate change is insignificant, which is exactly right. They're not, the population is small enough, and it's not an economic powerhouse. They just don't emit significant levels of greenhouse gases. But they're going to be affected. The glaciers are melting. Their access to water is going to be challenged. It's actually, agriculture is going to be more problematic. Their tourism industry, which is important, will be affected. So these poor countries that did not contribute are really going to be strongly affected. South Africa is another place, or in fact, many African countries are already experiencing really serious impacts. And this is an older map. I couldn't find an updated one, but it's still true. You can see the people who are dying, due to climate change. It's definitely not evenly distributed, and it's definitely not the people who are really contributing the most to the problem. So there are different levels of vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Some people, of course, are geographically vulnerable. They happen to live in areas that are more susceptible, again, like coastal areas or areas prone to drought or low-lying islands. Some people are more economically vulnerable, as I just suggested, and this is because financial resources can help you, in many cases, cope with the impacts of climate change. Things as simple as buying air conditioning and bottled water, to rebuilding your house if it's been damaged, to having the resources to move to a different area. Some people are socially vulnerable because they have less sort of political power. And including this, if we think around the world, women and members of marginalized communities, they often have less political clout. They have less access to information. So they are often more directly affected by some of the consequences of climate change. For example, in a lot of African countries, women are responsible for going to get fresh water, and they have to go further and further to get fresh water. They have to go further and further to get firewood. And then some people are actually physiologically vulnerable. We see this every time there's a heat wave. Some people are particularly vulnerable, including the elderly. They're much more likely to die during heat waves. And those already suffering from mental illness are also more at risk, partly because a lot of medications that are taken by people with mental illness actually interfere with their ability to regulate their own body temperature. So they're more likely to get overheated. I want to particularly emphasize, because I think we all care a lot about this, that children are particularly vulnerable. They are also physiologically more vulnerable because their bodily systems are not fully developed. So we know, for example, children are not necessarily as good at, I shouldn't say good at it, it's not a skill. They're not necessarily as capable of regulating their body temperature. They're more at risk to disease and pollutants. They have more power. They're less able to withstand periods of malnutrition. So their developing bodies may be sort of permanently impaired by negative events such as periods of starvation or disease or stress. And stress itself can make them more vulnerable. They're also more socially vulnerable, however. For example, natural disasters may disrupt their education, and in some parts of the world or at some life stages, children whose education has been disrupted may just never go back. The disruption is so long, they just don't bother. Even if they do go back, they probably have lost some ground due to that disruption. They're more dependent on other people to look after them. So if other social networks are disrupted, children are less capable of fending for themselves. And they're sort of more psychologically vulnerable. Their psyches, as well as their bodies, are developing, especially among the youngest children. So having security is very important. And if they have the sort of, if they feel insecure at that age, it may end up having a sort of permanent impact on their psychological well-being. And of course, the effects will depend on the child's developmental stage. So, 1-year-olds are going to be differently affected than 15-year-olds. 12-year-olds will be differently affected than 6-year-olds. And they're also not inevitable. So children who have strong social networks will be less affected than those who are already in sort of fragile conditions. With all this emphasis on how different groups will be differently affected, I want to stress that inequality itself can be a threat to mental health. When we have increased inequality, people may feel less control over their lives. People lower in the, in the social hierarchy may think less well of themselves, or at least of their abilities, of their sort of ability to succeed in the world. Of course, there's increased stress, and we've seen lots of research associated with the fact that people who are economically insecure are more stressed all the time. There can be social isolation associated with being in a marginalized community. And then even for the people who are not maybe at the bottom of the ladder, there's insecurity associated with inequality, because then you worry if you can maintain your current position or if you might drop further down. And I think that's something that affects the middle class a lot. All right, so now I'm getting to the more positive part. I think I really want to stress that although it's important to know what the effects of climate change will be, it's also important for us to move forward and think about, okay, what are we going to do about it? It's not, climate change is a problem, it's a threat, but we've faced problems and threats before, and some of them we've dealt with very effectively. So there are things that can be done if we kind of face up to the problem to promote resilience. Most people do recover from trauma. So I talked about the negative effects of natural disasters, but even though we would like to avoid those negative effects, by far the majority of people do not develop, mental illness following a natural disaster. And some people even talk about what's been described as post-traumatic growth. So in contrast to post-traumatic stress, that the experience of the natural disaster actually helped them to discover a sense of meaning in their lives. And sometimes people come together as a community to recover from the natural disaster. And that too is a very positive experience. So when we think about climate change, becoming actively involved in addressing it can help people cope with the stress of worrying about it. And again, another quote from Hurricane Sandy survivors saying, the best way for us to heal was to help others. So again, coming together as a community, it doesn't just cancel out the negative effects, it can actually have a positive effect. Resilient communities are characterized by a variety of attributes. One is they need to provide practical support. So it's not all in our head. There can be support to help people recover from a disaster, to rebuild their houses, to get the food and water they need, just to get the information they need. Having strong community ties makes people and communities more resilient. So strengthening social networks within a community. And those community ties can often be associated with religious organizations, for example. It's important to keep a sense of optimism. That may sound like a kind of catch-22, that you're more at risk if you are more worried. But if you can kind of maintain hope, it actually does promote thriving in the face of adversity. And then, of course, there's concrete steps as well. Actively coping with the issue, actively doing things to prepare yourself. So what can we all individually do to kind of promote greater resilience? We can educate people about what to expect, something I've sort of tried to say today, and how to adapt, and especially at a local level. So people should know, what are the threats for them in their area? Are they at risk of drought? Are they at risk of flooding? Are they at risk of heavy storms? So I think we increasingly see recommendations that people have emergency kits prepared. We can do that with regard to climate change by knowing what am I facing in my area? This could be especially informed by a vulnerability assessment, both as an individual and as a community. What are the weaknesses? What could we perhaps shore up? Do we need to revamp our bridges? Do we need to improve our storm sewers, et cetera? And individuals can't do it all by themselves. We need infrastructure that encourages people to adapt. So that might be, again, help for farmers to learn how they might want to modify their planting practices, the types of things they plant, or the ways they cultivate them. It might mean encouraging people to protect their house against flooding, etc. We need to also really emphasize the social context, because I'll just throw in that social support is not just associated with resilience, it's very strongly associated with physical health. So strengthening social networks, not just within existing groups, but across groups, so that people talk to each other. When thinking about how to help a community prepare, don't just think about the average citizen, consider the most vulnerable citizen and how they might be affected in the case of a natural disaster. Don't just plan for physical safety, but plan for mental health resources. Again, encourage optimism, but also give people a sense of efficacy. I think I said earlier that working to address this challenge is associated with resilience. When people believe that there's something they can do, it's a very powerful, positive factor. And then we can all think more and talk more about co-benefits. Co-benefits is a term that's used to describe essentially the fringe benefits that are associated with addressing climate change. So even people who are not willing to address climate change, maybe they don't believe it's happening, or they don't believe that it's associated with human activity, so there's no point doing anything, can appreciate some of the things that might be involved. For example, if we reduced our use of fossil fuels, not only would that reduce carbon emissions, it would also reduce pollution, which is very strongly negatively associated with death. If we eliminate coal-burning power plants or reduce our reliance on coal-burning power plants, we reduce mercury pollution, which has documented impacts on our cognitive abilities. People in this country don't get enough physical activity. In fact, it's a cause of death. So if we encourage people to walk or cycle instead of taking their car, not only does that reduce climate change, but has other positive impacts on health. And finally, eating less red meat, and I'm not saying you have to give it up entirely, but just eating less, would definitely reduce the risks of heart disease and death while also reducing carbon emissions. So again, for people who don't, for whatever reason, feel motivated to address climate change, we can say, do these things for your health. And maybe that will be convincing. And finally, I also want to emphasize that if we think not just of the threats that nature can pose, but of the sources of strength that can also be found in the natural world. And this area of research has just been booming lately. There's research just showing that looking at nature and being in nature has very positive effects, even on physical health. So hospital patients who can look at nature through their window recover from surgery more quickly. People who spend time in the natural world have greater positive emotions, less stress. And these positive emotions, again, have positive impacts on physical health. So reduced levels of heart disease and depression. So I'm just going to close by saying, if we think about not just coping with climate change as like, how can we avoid as many of the negative effects as possible? We can think about it as an opportunity to rethink some of the ways we live our lives, both as individuals and as a society. Thinking about how to cope with climate change to avoid these health impacts might encourage us to examine the social structure of our communities as well as the physical structure, and think about ways of enhancing well-being. And I know, and you probably know as well, that many people feel that there are aspects of our current way of life that do need change, that we are increasingly alienated from each other, that we're working too hard, that we're not healthy. So climate change can be a stimulus to encourage us to make changes that will have more, positive effects. So I would encourage you all to personally cope with climate change by informing yourself, but then talk to other people about it. Get involved if possible and coordinate with other people. And think not just about your personal readiness, but the social context. So even though people often say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Each person can lead by example, and examples are incredibly powerful, actually. Oftentimes, many people are sort of waiting to do something, but they don't want to be the first person to do it. So you try making a move to address climate change, and you might find a number of people sort of falling in behind you. And this also, sort of addressing the issue, can overcome our collective ignorance as a society, where everybody is kind of thinking about climate change, but they don't hear a lot of other people talking about it, so they assume that most people aren't that worried. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to share with you this quote from The Lancet, which is a medical journal, and they describe it this way: that we need to think about, we need to shift from thinking about climate change solely as a threat and recognizing that it is, in fact, an opportunity to enhance human health and well-being. So thank you. And that's it. I think we may have time for a few questions. I'm not sure. And I can't figure out how to stop. There we go. So I'll let somebody there decide.
I think we do have a few minutes for question and answer. I think probably just one or two questions. We have about 5-6 minutes left. So a brief one. Nothing too much.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. I'm a biblical scholar, theologian, and so I am trying to think through how classroom and church can be an active component of enhancing well-being and mental health based on climate change. I'm wondering if there are any stories. For instance, you had that picture of the Dust Bowl victims there, that classic iconic photograph. Are there stories there about the communities in Oklahoma that have become much more resilient as a result of an ecological disaster back in that day that we can learn from today? I just asked because you showed that photograph, and that is an instance in American history in which there was an ecological disaster that communities have seemed to overcome.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the honest answer is I don't know, because I haven't really looked into it. But one thing I like about your question is that it emphasizes the importance of telling stories, and that's a really useful way, I think, both to understand climate change and also to communicate about it instead of just giving dry statistics, some of which I gave you, to talk about, particular people and particular families and particular communities and how they were affected, and also how they responded to these changes. Thank you.
We've got one more question over here. I think this will be our.
Hi, I'm Rick Randolph. And do you have any recommendations for how to approach local governments? We have the education, but are there any ways that you see that might be beneficial in making those approaches?
That's a great question. I've certainly tried to talk to government officials on, sometimes, maybe occasionally with a little success, but more often with not. But I would say you can find, it's better to find areas of common ground than to try to confront them with something that they are just going to refuse to accept or to deal with. So you might be able to talk to them about local economic impacts of climate change, for example. Or again, health impacts is something most people want to avoid. One of my senators in Ohio happened to be very interested in the park system, even though he was not particularly progressive on environmental issues in general. So I was sort of able to share that common ground with him about the love for parks and the recognizing the importance of nature. So whatever your particular official really values, and I'm an optimist. I think that most of our elected officials are at least trying to do something good in some way. So if you can explain to them why this is important to the community, whether it be economically or because we all love our local environment, we hate to see it changing, or because we want to protect the health of the community, I think we want to save energy. There are some conservative communities that are rallying around